Hilda, Chapter 7, Decisions, Part 1. 2 days had passed, and I had found a kind of uneasy rhythm in the basement. The weight of everything, Paul's arrest, Bruno's involvement, the uncertainty of whether I'd ever be free again pressed down on me constantly, but I kept my head down and followed Bauer's rules. Getting back to rule number 1, no sneaking out of the basement. I couldn't afford to be caught outside. If anyone unexpected came, I wouldn't have time to run to the basement without raising suspicion. So I stayed. I tried to sleep, though sleep was thin and fragile, like a spider's web that could break with the lightest touch. It was early morning, maybe just after dawn, when I was jolted awake by a noise, something heavy. My heart leaped into my throat. I blinked, disorientated, still half caught in the remnants of a dream, but I knew that sound wasn't part of it. I strained to listen. There was footsteps upstairs, someone unfamiliar, a stranger. My body reacted faster than my mind. Instinct, survival, fear. Hide. I scrambled to my feet, panicking. Where? Where could I hide? And then I heard it. The voice of a few men, low and unfamiliar, talking to Bauer upstairs. They were getting closer. The basement door creaked. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away, like a drum sounding the alarm. Footsteps descended the stairs, slow and deliberate. They were coming down. I tried to steady my breath. The air was cold, beating at my skin, but all I could feel was the heat of my terror. From my hiding spot, I saw Bauer first. She was in front of the man, guiding him down the stairs, while the other man stayed upstairs, her face tight, her eyes wide with a fear she was trying to conceal. But I knew her too well by now. I could see it, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gestured, the strain in her voice as she spoke. "There's nothing down here, really," she said. Her voice was a little too high, a little too quick. "Just old junk, tools, storage, nothing of interest." The man didn't respond. He was taller than Bauer, broader. I could see his face clearly from my angle, just the back of his head and his stiff posture as he scanned the room. He didn't trust her. I could feel it. He wasn't here by accident. They were getting closer to the trapdoor. My heart raced faster. Bauer hesitated when they approached the small, discovered trapdoor in the floor, the one I had used, the one I'd be hiding in now. She stopped in front of it, blocking the man's way for a moment. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp, suspicious. He pointed at the trapdoor. "Nothing," Bauer replied quickly, too quickly. It's just a little storage space, hardly ever used. You don't want to go down there, probably full of mice and rats. Filthy." Her voice cracked slightly. I could see her eyes flick to the door, and I could see the terror in them. She thought I was in there. She was scared to death when they'd open it, thinking I'd be discovered. I could see her throat tighten as she swallowed hard. She was trying to hold it together, but the fear was eating away at her. The man stepped closer, his hand hovering over the handle of the trapdoor. For a second, I thought this was it. He was going to open it, and Bauer's worst fear would be realized. From my corner, I watched her face, the panic that flickered across it, the tightness in her jaw. She was terrified, trying so hard to protect me. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I was not there, that she didn't have to worry about the trapdoor. And then the man moved closer and opened the trapdoor, sweeping his eyes over the empty trapdoor, lingering too long in his place. Bauer was shocked, but relieved at the same time. And as he stepped back, I realized something. I'd been lucky. When I'd first heard the noise, when I'd panicked and tried to hide, I hadn't known where to go. I'd chosen the first place that came to my mind, behind the shelves, not the trapdoor, and somehow it had been the right choice. I guess I chose the best place after all, I thought, a bitter smile pulling at the corners of my lips. If I'd hidden in the trapdoor like Bauer thought I had, they'd have found me by now. After what felt like hours, the man finally seemed to lose interest. He searched the basement for a few more minutes, poking around the shelves and boxes, but his attention was fading. He muttered something under his breath, something about the cold, and started back up the stairs. Bauer followed him, her body tense. She cast one last glance around the basement before she left, her eyes searching confused. Where is she? I could almost hear her thinking. When the door closed behind them and the sound of their voices upstairs faded, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My body was shaking from the adrenaline, and I slumped against the wall, exhausted. The sound of my own voice singing softly in my head pulled me back to a moment I had tried to forget. I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me. "Come downstairs, Hilda," my father's voice called, full of excitement. I walked down the steps, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and nervous. When I reached the bottom, I saw him standing next to a microphone, its cord snagging across the floor to a recorder. He held the microphone out to me, a smile on his face. "Here, hold this," he said, pushing it gently into my hands. I felt its cool, smooth surface under my skin. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a microphone," he explained, his voice full of pride. "Speak into it, and then we'll listen to your voice together." I stared at it for a second. What should I say?" "Anything you want," he said, then paused, his face lighting up. "Or how about you sing a song? You've got that lovely voice." I felt my cheeks grew warm. Singing wasn't something I did in front of people often, but I loved it when I was alone. I hesitated for a moment. What should I sing?" He chuckled. "Why not Lily Marlin? You hum that all the time." I couldn't help but smile. It was true. That song had stuck with me for as long as I could remember. I lifted the microphone to my lips and began singing, quietly at first. Vor der Gasse nun vor dem großen Tor stand eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor.
So wollen wir uns da wiedersehen, bei der Laterne wollen wir stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen, wie einst Lili Marleen.
The melody slipped from me, filling the room, growing louder as I found my voice. I let the sadness and hope in the song carry me. I had heard it on the radio so many times. Now it was coming from me. My father watched, adjusting the recorder as my voice echoed softly. When I finished, my father clapped, his eyes shining with pride. "That was beautiful, Hilda. Now come up and listen." I followed him upstairs, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. He pressed a button, and suddenly there it was, my voice playing in the room. It sounded different, but in a way that made me proud. I could hear every note, every word, as if I were still standing there, singing. "Do you hear that?" my father asked, his grin wide. "It sounds perfect." I laughed, the sound feeling light and free. "The quality is so good, it's like I'm still singing." The melody still etched in my mind, even as I stood there in the dim light of the basement, my heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. I heard the creak of the door, and my head snapped up. Barbara stepped into the basement, her eyes immediately finding mine, widening with panic. "Oh gosh," she whispered, her voice shaky. Without thinking, I rushed forward and pressed my hand over her mouth. My finger flew to my lips, signaling for silence. She froze, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion, but she nodded. I motioned for a pen and paper, gesturing toward the small desk in the corner. She understood, moving quietly to grab them. I screamed frantically, "Look around for a microphone." I handed it to her, my chest tightening with fear. She read the notes, her face paling, and I could see the dread building in her expression. She nodded, then started glancing around the room, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, louder than any sound I could make. The idea that someone could be listening to us made my skin crawl. Barbara moved slowly, her steps cautious as she checked the room, and I stayed still, trying not to make a sound, hoping that whatever was happening we were safe, at least for now. Barbara's movements were careful, her eyes scanning the walls and ceiling, the corners where shadows collected. My heart raced as I watched her, knowing that any moment we might discover something we didn't want to find. Then, suddenly, she froze. Her eyes fixed on a small, barely noticeable object tucked near one of the support beams in the far corner of the basement. She stepped closer, bending down to get a better look. Her fingers reached out, trembling slightly, and when they touched it, her face went pale. She glanced back at me, and I knew it instantly. She had found it, the microphone. Bauer turned toward me, holding the small device in her hand. My stomach dropped. It was real. He dropped it here. I motioned for her to hand it over, my mind racing with what to do next. Bauer hesitated, but she placed it gently in my palm. It felt cold and heavy. I glanced at Bauer, my heart racing as I clutched the microphone in my hand. We had to move it, far enough that it wouldn't capture anything. I gestured toward the stairs, silently telling her that I had an idea. She nodded, and we both moved quietly, our footsteps barely making a sound as we crept up toward the house. When we reached Bauer's bedroom, I hesitated for a moment, glancing around. The room felt oddly peaceful compared to the tension downstairs, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. I crouched down beside her bed and carefully lifted the edge of the mattress. It wasn't a perfect hiding spot, but it was far from the basement, and most importantly, far from where we could talk. I slid the microphone underneath, making sure it was securely hidden between the mattress and the floor. The dust under the bed coated my fingers, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was how much time this would buy us. Once I stood up, I wiped my hands on my trousers, glancing over at Bauer. She was watching me, her face still pale, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. I motioned for us to head back down to the basement.
Wie einst Lili Marley, wie einst Lili Marley.
As soon as we were back, I sat down and exhaled, trying to calm the adrenaline rushing through me. Bauer joined me, sitting close. "They won't record anything from up there," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The microphone is too far now. This is what my dad told me. We're safe, for now." Bauer's shoulders relaxed a little, but the tension in the air remained. We both knew that this was temporary. Whatever surveillance was happening, it could intensify, but for the moment, we had outsmarted them. We sat there in the basement, the walls around us pressing in, both of us against them, two figures trapped between fear and silence. Bauer had slumped against the cold stone, and I had sat in the makeshift bed I had claimed, my back stiff, eyes staring at her. She looked up, her face pale, voice fragile when she spoke. "I can do this." I turned my head towards her, wondering if I had misheard. "I'll come with you," she added, almost as if trying to convince herself. "Where?" I asked, my voice low. "Anywhere you have to go," she said, a trace of desperation in her tone. I blinked, confused. "Come on, teacher, it's not a game," I replied, more sharply than I intended. I could see her hands trembling slightly, the weight of everything crushing down on her. This was real, and we both knew it. She swallowed hard, then said, "I can't leave you out there. Anything might happen to you." Her concern felt like a punch to the chest. "So what?" I shot back. "We're both women. Even if you come with me, we might both die." She clenched her jaw and said, "I can protect you." I laughed under my breath, the absurdity of the situation overwhelming me. "I don't want you to come." She glared at me, her eyes burning with something between anger and fear. "I can't leave you," she repeated, her voice rising. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "Shut up!" she suddenly screamed, the words bouncing off the walls. The outburst shocked me into silence, the sound of it ringing in the quiet basement. I stared at her, stunned, watching as she stood up and walked towards me. Her body was still shaking, her movements tense from everything that had happened. "I can't imagine sending a child out there all alone," she said, her voice cracking as she came closer. I met her gaze, feeling a sharp sting at the word child. "I'm not a child," I replied, trying to push back. "You are a child, Hilda," she said, her voice firm but filled with pain. "And they're Nazis." The truth of it settled between us, as heavy as the stone walls surrounding us. I didn't know what to say. Her eyes were red, her voice barely steady. "I can't let you go alone," she repeated, almost like a plea now. I looked down, hating how small her words made me feel. "You're sacrificing yourself, and I hate that," I whispered. She crouched beside me, close enough that I could feel her trembling. "I'm not," she said softly. There was no heroism in her voice, no bravado, just something raw, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I murmured, "Why are you risking your life?" Her breath hitched, and a single tear slipped away from her eye, tracing a path down her cheek. It startled me. Was this the first time I had seen her break down? Bara, who always seemed to carry the weight of the world without a crack in her armor, was breaking before my eyes. She looked away, wiping the tear with the back of her hand. "You don't get it," she whispered, her voice so quiet, almost fragile, like she was trying to keep it from shattering into pieces. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked upstairs. Her footsteps were slow, heavy. I watched her go, unable to move or speak. The basement felt colder without her in it. I just sat there, sat and stared at the corner of the room, my mind black and my body too tired to follow her. The silence after she left was suffocating, like all the air had been pulled from the room. My thoughts swirled, but none of them made sense. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Bauer's footsteps. I blinked, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the basement. She was there with a tray, her face softer than usual, almost like she had slept for the first time in weeks. I sat up as she handed me the tray with breakfast. She sat down beside me, her back against the wall as I peeked at my meal. We didn't say much at first, the silence between us almost comfortable, like we both knew words weren't necessary. But I kept looking at her, glancing up between bites. There was always something going on behind her eyes, something I couldn't quite figure out. After a while, she finally spoke. "Don't be scared if anyone rings the bell today," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's supposed to be Bruno. He might stop by with news." I nodded, my stomach tightening at the thought. The idea of anyone coming near the house filled me with dread, but I trusted Bauer. If she said not to be scared, I had to believe her, though that didn't stop the unease from spreading through me. We went back to eating in silence. My eyes drifted to her again. She sat there, staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. I wondered what was going on in her mind. I felt like Bauer was a puzzle, so many pieces scattered that I couldn't quite see how they fit together. She was tough, but underneath that there was something else. I had seen it in her eyes when she talked about her family, about what happened to her mother. There was pain there, something deep and unhealed. I swallowed the last piece of bread and wiped my hands on my lap. "You're such a complicated person," I blurted out before I could stop myself. She looked at me, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean by that?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain it without sounding strange. "I don't know. It's just sometimes I feel like I don't understand you. You do so much for me, but you keep things locked away, like you're carrying something I can't see." Bauer didn't respond right away. She looked down at the floor, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, I thought maybe I had crossed a line, that maybe I shouldn't have said anything at all. But then she sighed, the kind of sigh that sounded like she'd been holding it in for a long time. "It's not your job to understand me," she said softly. "You've got enough to worry about." I frowned, feeling like she was brushing me off, but I couldn't push her any further. Instead, I just nodded and I turned back to my empty plate. But the thought stayed with me. Bauer was right. I had enough to worry about, but still there was something about her that made me want to know more, to understand the person who was risking so much for me. I didn't know if I'd ever get the answers I was looking for, but sitting there beside her, I knew one thing for certain. I trusted her with my life. Later that morning, there was a knock at the door. I froze me too, my heartbeat quickening. Bauer didn't move for a moment either, but then she gave me a reassuring glance before rising to her feet. "It's him," she whispered, though I wasn't sure if it was meant for me or herself. She moved towards the door with a kind of calmness that I envied, while I stayed behind the basement, sitting stiffly, every muscle in my body tense. The creak of the door opening echoed through the quiet house, followed by the sound of voices, Bauer's hushed tone, and her brother's deeper, more gruff reply. I could make out some of the words, though they were trying to keep the conversation low. Bauer came back downstairs after a few minutes, her brother following behind. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles around his eyes, his jaw tense, his hair slightly disheveled. I didn't know much about him, just that he was someone Bauer trusted, but his presence alone was enough to make me feel a little safer, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just a promise of a plan, a way out. He didn't waste any time. "Here," he said, handing me a small bundle of papers. My hands shook slightly as I took them. Fake identification. I glanced down at the new name and details that weren't mine. An entire identity for someone I wasn't, yet had to become. "This should hold up at the checkpoints," he said. "It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing." I stared at the papers, my stomach twisting into knots. This was it, the first real step towards leaving. The thought of crossing borders without this false identity in hand made me feel sick, but I nodded, trying to look braver than I felt. "That's good, right?" Bauer's brother asked, watching me closely. But before I could answer, Bauer spoke up. "I need one too." Her brother wiped his head toward her, eyes wide with shock. "What?" "I need a fake identity," Bauer repeated, her voice calm but firm. "I'm going with her." His face contorted in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am." His voice rose, incredulous. "Martha, do you have any idea what you're saying? You can't just leave your life behind. It's dangerous enough for her. You're going to put yourself at risk too?" "I know what I'm doing," she shot back, but there was an edge to her voice that betrayed her uncertainty. "Oh, do you?" He was almost shouting now, pacing the small room, his hand running through his hair in frustration. "Do you really? You're talking about fleeing the country, abandoning everything. They're already looking for her. Her picture is almost everywhere. But you? What happens if they find out you're hiding a fugitive? You'll be signing your own death sentence." Bauer stood tall, meeting his anger with her own. "I've already lost everything. I'm not leaving her to die." My breath caught in my throat. They were talking about me like I wasn't even there, but the weight of their words pressed down on me like a crushing force. I wanted to say something, anything to stop this fight, but I was frozen, unable to move or speak. "You're out of your mind," he spat. "You're going to throw your life away for a kid?" "She's not just a kid," Bauer yelled back, her voice shaking. "And yes, I would rather risk my life than let her die alone." Her brother stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. For a long moment the room was silent, except for the sound of their labored breathing. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between protecting his sister and the fear of losing her. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower, more controlled. "I can't let you do this." "It's not your decision," Bauer said, her tone softer but no less determined. "I'm coming with her." "Martha, please," he pleaded, his voice breaking slightly. "This isn't just about you. Think about what you're asking. What happens if they catch you? What happens if they—" "I know the risks," she interrupted, her voice firm again, "but I'm not letting her go alone." I looked between the two of them, feeling like an intruder in this argument. My chest tightened with guilt. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I was supposed to leave alone, to get out before things got worse, not to drag Bauer down with me. I finally found my voice, though it came out quieter than I intended. "Teacher, please, you don't have to do this." She turned to me, her eyes softening for the first time since the argument began. "Yes, I do." He stepped closer to me, his eyes dark and filled with anger. For a moment, I thought he was going to shout again, but instead, his voice dropped low, almost a growl. "If anything happens to my sister because of you," he said, leaning in so close I could feel his breath on my face, "I swear I'll be worse than any Nazi you have ever met." My body went rigid. The threat was sharp, and it caught deep. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt small, powerless under his gaze. Before I could react, Bauer was in front of me. She moved so fast, I didn't even have the time to process it. Without a word, she slapped him in face, her voice trembling with fury as she hissed, "You want to help me or not? If you don't, then get the fuck out of my house instead of threatening my child." My child. The words echoed in my mind, bouncing around like an unfamiliar melody. I froze, the shock of it spreading through me like ice. She had never called me that before. I had always been just Hilda, but a student to her, the student she was helping. But now I was her child? A wave of warmth surged through me, and for a moment, despite everything, the danger, the fear, the uncertainty, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I felt safe. The room went dead silent. Her brother stood there, stunned, his chest heaved with unspoken rage, but he didn't move. He just stared at Bawa and then at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and resignation. After what felt like an eternity, he exhaled slowly and straightened up. His voice was quieter now, though the edge hadn't entirely disappeared. "Fine," he murmured. "Sit down, both of you." We moved to the table, the tension still thick in the air, though now it was different, more controlled. We sat across from him, Bauer's hands brushing against mine for a brief moment, grounding me. I clung to that feeling, to the strange newfound sense of belonging that her words had stirred in me. Her brother took a deep breath, then began speaking in a tone that was all business now. "Here's the plan. There's a train heading to Munich in 3 days. It's mostly for supplies, but there will be a few passengers. You'll be posing as one of them." He slid a piece of paper across the table, the fake identity he had given me earlier. "This will get you through most of the checkpoints, but not all of them. Some will ask questions. You'll need to be careful." He glanced at me, and then at Bauer, as if weighing this next word carefully. "Once you're out of the city, you'll be passed off to a group that can take you further west. From there, it's going to get harder. The borders are being watched closely, but there's a chance. A slim one, but a chance." Bauer listened intently, her eyes flickering with determination. "And what about me?" He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I'll get you your papers, but once you're with her, you're on your own. I can't help you after that." Bauer nodded. "I understand." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, the weight of what we were planning clearly taking toll on him. "You'll need to move fast. Pack only what you absolutely need. No personal items, nothing that ties you back here." He looked between the two of us again, his jaw tight. "This is dangerous. If you get caught, there's nothing I can do. You'll be on your own." I nodded, trying to push down the rising fear in my chest. The reality of what we were planning hit me like a wave. This wasn't just running anymore, this was survival. Bauer placed a hand on my arm, her touch steadying me once more. "We'll make it," she said quietly, her eyes looking with mine. Her brother stood up abruptly, clearly done with the conversation. "I'll bring the papers tomorrow," he said, his tone clipped. "Be ready." As he turned toward the door, I suddenly remembered the microphone. My heart skipped a beat as I thought of it, still hidden upstairs under Bauer's bed. I couldn't let him leave without dealing with it. "Wait," I blurted out, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. Both Bauer and her brother looked at me, eyebrows raised in question. "The microphone in your bedroom." Bauer blinked, then sighed. "Right, go get it," she said, her voice steady, though I could tell she was tense. I stood, feeling the weight of their eyes on me as I made my way up the stairs, my legs heavy with exhaustion. When I reached the bedroom, I knelt by the bed and retrieved the hidden microphone. It felt oddly cold in my hands, like it had absorbed the chill of the room. For a second, I just stared at it, my mind reeling with everything that had happened. Then I straightened up and walked back downstairs. As soon as I reached the bottom, I noticed something had shifted. The air between Bauer and her brother was thick with unsaid words. They weren't looking at each other, both lost in their own thoughts. Had I interrupted something? I didn't know, but the silence between them was palpable. For a moment I hesitated, standing in the doorway with the microphone in my hand, unsure of what to do. The pause felt long, awkward. Finally I stepped forward and silently handed the microphone to Bauer's brother. He took it without a word, his expression unreadable as his fingers curled around it. The three of us stood there, the weight of everything that had been said hanging in the room. No one spoke. Bruno nodded once, a brief, tight acknowledgement, then turned and left the house. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me and Bauer alone in the suffocating quiet.